you impressed with AI at the moment? How do you think about the space at the moment?
Um, Very impressed, although not and hopeful with some concerns. Uh, and think actually it will connect back to consciousness. And the next steps I'm thinking of for working on trying to actually understand what is consciousness, because I think ultimately, for some of the hopes for AI, it is not separable. Even though consciousness and intelligence are separable, the kinds of intelligence that we ultimately want for the full promise and also with risks, I believe, is connected to consciousness. So at the present moment, this approach, even though it seems like uh, the scaling hypothesis and the strong variance has been falsified largely in terms of the tests they're starting to bonk. Even Ilya, Hinton is still beating the drum that in the latent space everything's happening, but he's wrong. And even Ilya is like, yeah, we need new paradigms. And like, there's a general consensus, like like Irina at Mila, or Irina Risch is like, yeah, yeah, she's an expert in like this, like physics informed approach and emergences and grok, and she's like, nope, it's we need something different, and maybe something biologically inspired, more that works like the ways we do, that realizes things like system to AI and conscious functions. But so the current approaches, though, as they are though, and their deployment, the foundation models, they are exquisite still. Now, can we? And I do think they might be something like a fourth industrial revolution if we lean into them. So I'm extremely impressed with them, and hopeful for what happens for continuing within that paradigm. Although I am concerned about some of the energy requirements that's needed to run them. It's possible we still come out ahead, although it's possible that new computing paradigms, specifically leveraging like thermodynamic computing, could change the shape of that. Um, and so we could still be leveraging many of the algorithms we're leveraging now, but by other means, deploying different varieties of them. Uh, you know, Things like that happening, like with Guillaume Verdun and Extropic, with delves in details about the politics of that and the accelerationism versus doomerism. But still, this idea of is it worth like the Nvidia all the way with the
Yeah.
nuclear power plants? It could be worth it in terms of the payoff, but what would likely be even more worth it would be more efficient designs. It's just not clear to me. I think you probably would get a return on investment from the current ones. It's just something else is coming that's going to be even better still and much less energy intensive. Now, I guess it had the like a brief tangent into like I guess since I mentioned it, like the accelerationist versus doomer issue, and then I guess touching back on consciousness. Um, so in general, it seems like among like the risks. So like we're deploying these things. It's the year of the agent. People are big. It's like, what does an agent even mean? And so I'm organizing a special issue of Royal Society to dig into that issue of like, what's an agent? Um, what are we talking about agents that are self-reflexive in what kinds of ways, that could plan with depth in what kinds of ways, and be good enough in their planning and coherent enough in their modeling of the things they're modeling, including us as causes in the world, that they could be capable of something like doing science for us, or being our agents in the world in a flexible and safe way? Um, or are we talking about agents that could like recursively self-improve and explode a superintelligence? Yeah, I don't think so. That's the whole thing. So not impressed by some of the dangers there, but impressed that they could be powerful. Impressed that there's some risks for it being potentially fraught for aligning them. There could be some harms, but not necessarily harms of an existential variety.
Yeah.
Um, so that's a lot of things, but basically, very impressed, a little bit worried, not as worried about other people, and think that if we connect it to basically consciousness, we will both be more impressed, potentially more worried, but not if we do it right.
And right at the start, you mentioned consciousness is not the same as intelligence in some fundamental way, and so, as you say, the year of the agent, we maybe want to create more than just large language models. But then, what is an agent? I wondered. Tell me more about them. Can we have cognition and intelligence without consciousness?
Yeah, I think we can have like, um, I don't know if I'd say arbitrary degrees, but amazing degrees of intelligence without consciousness, um, and amazing degrees of even agenticness without consciousness. But with consciousness, some forms of intelligence being enabled that are hard to enable by other means, and some forms of agency being realized that would be hard to enable by other means. But that being said, with intelligence and agency um, being things that arise in a wide range of systems, which we may or may not want to call conscious, depending on how we want to use the word conscious. If we're using the word conscious as like entailing a kind of modeling or of the world, and even of a system in its relationship to the world, then we could potentially call that conscious or sentient in some respects, especially if there's like this knowledge is connected to a kind of valuing and a valuing even of a kind of like autopoetic variety or like where there's semantic information that's relevant to the survival of the system. But I tend to want to reserve the word consciousness though for systems where their models and like the information geometry of their modeling is such that it would entail something like qualia, something that it feels like, and a stream of experience. And for me, I specifically reserve the word consciousness in my focus, even though I think all of the uses, as long as you use more words to describe what we're talking about, like conscious access, self-reflexive conscious, they're all good uses. But I focus on um, what it feels like to be a given system with a world appearing to it, organized by a certain perspectival reference frame with a lived body in the center, as this system moves through time as a kind, potentially as a kind of cause, as a kind of agent moving through time, where it's basically this iterative state estimation of system and its relationship to the world, and the sensorium or life world of this agent, allowing it to basically take actions. And really, consciousness is a kind of predictive causal transition model that's being generated iteratively, that is something like a stream of experience that's being used for the sake of action selection, including with respect to covert action and imagination. So for me, that's consciousness. It's like that's what it's like for me. It's like here's this world coming at me, and it feels like something. I'm at the center. Now you could say there's other things, but basically, that's you could say well, there's other kinds of consciousness. But I don't know. Maybe you would
Yeah.
say that's modeling or other kinds of sentience. But for me, like the thing I think we specifically want for the kinds of autonomy and intelligence we want to have these flexible systems capable of being out in the world, engaging in lifelong learning in open-ended worlds, including us. I think we need something like qualia and consciousness to pull off that trick, to ground our symbols, to handle causation in the ways where the systems will be reliable and where we can interact with them and they will be intelligent with respect to us. That being said, remarkable degrees of intelligence are found throughout the natural world and even agentic phenomenon. But in terms of conscious agency, that I think is more of a latecomer in evolution and requires certain types of major transitions to happen and certain types of adaptations and architectural implementations. There can be multiple ones that do it, but so like slime molds are exquisite in what they can do. Their intelligence is remarkable. They can solve problems that I can't solve, and so it's like they're more intelligent than me in many domains, and they're better at being slime molds than I am. But they're not capable of, like, for instance, navigating a world of causes like me and you, and in that domain, their intelligence, um, I'd say, is limited partially because they don't have the right kind of, I would say, modeling capacities and even consciousness.
The way I was listening to Mark Solms and Michael Levin talk recently, and Mark Solms is sometimes willing to go all the way down with consciousness as long as it's we're thinking about consciousness in a very fundamental way and it's to do with affect. And but when the way he was thinking about it is when it's to do with trade-offs, and we need to why there's qualia is that we need to aggregate lots of different phenomena as an agent so that we can actually say this is fear, this is emotion, this is joy, this is pleasure, and it needs to be a sensation, and that requires some level of complexity of being an agent, but perhaps low levels, even cells could have something of this. Nevertheless, I mean, I agree. There's something fundamental about humanness that is different, and I wonder what that is. And maybe we don't need to answer the specific question about consciousness, but to loop it back to AI, I find it interesting because whether we it even matters exactly if we need a good definition of consciousness here, but if we are if we're creating intelligence of some kind, I guess I kind of want to, as you say, a slime mold has a kind of intelligence, and our liver and the different organs of ourself, we don't necessarily control them directly. They are kind of intelligences doing their own thing, and we actually wouldn't want them to
I'm
be.
more intelligent than I am. My liver's better at livering than I would be. If I tried to micromanage my liver, that would not end well.
Mm,
I,
yeah,
I cannot take over my liver's job description. Like,
and I wonder what that means. That there are many specific kinds of intelligences within their own domain. They're amazing, and we wouldn't even want to take control of them. And what that means for artificial intelligence and in our world, what it means to try and create even artificial intelligences.
it's interesting you bring up Mark because it's like in terms of like spectrums of positions. I'm like it's kind of like um, Mike has the most inclusive views on consciousness, and Mark would be like less inclusive, and I'd be like less inclusive still. And like it's like, but I think we're all kind of like on the same page of like certain fundamental principles of what's necessary for consciousness and intelligence and its connections to life management. So it's like Mike, for instance, like I've mentioned, like I've like beefed with Mark in the past in terms of like interpretations. I have a paper online where I kind of like dig into some of the issues of like why I think some of the lines of evidence he points to can be interpreted otherwise. But the idea, though, that like this idea of this the periaqueductal gray and this like a way of handling precision weighting based on a connection to the fundamentals of life management, and this being like the core thing for consciousness, and a necessary condition for its functioning, and that this is also an old story that extends into like uh, and so then going further with Mike and like Nick Lane, that this story actually is a deeper story. It goes back to the cell. You think of the Krebs cycle and the transformer. It's actually functionally exactly the same account that Mark Solms is describing in Hidden Spring, but Nick Lane is describing it for the Krebs cycle, and it's the same role. And even more interesting, you could probably, I don't want to get touched, well, technically you could probably model them both as kinds of transformer systems. Like, and so, but and so you're handling your precision weighting based on a moment to moment estimation of life management, where basically it's this one of the many ways in which life and mind cannot be separated. Um, and so with Mike, in terms of, and so I'm hoping actually to uh, start like something I'm calling a benevolent adversarial collaboration soon with both Mike and Mark. We're going to dig into the issue both with a discussion series and some co-written papers, and also test these things out in silico and an A Life platform that I'm developing with a friend. He's the engineer, but basically it could be capable of doing things like modeling the brain stem as precision weighter for basically a richly embodied agent. And with the same principles he's describing, the emphasis. I know he's already working those dimensions. I suspect this simulation environment may be better, but also you could do things like do cellular dynamics and model that too. It's like a flexible A Life simulation platform that can test out all these hypotheses and see how they work, even things like bioelectric fields. But in terms of the implications for AI that you mentioned, I think basically there is likely a kind of revolution in AI to be had from application of the principles that Mike is talking about, and also the principles that Mark is talking about. And these are both common and different revolutions. So kind of like an internet or like a world of many creatures moving about, coordinating in harmonious ways. Both like an Internet of Things, and it's connections to like Kevin Kelly might call like a mirror world involving like AR and VR, and like all these different agents like um, taking on all these different functions with different types of competence and doing jazz together to achieve goals flexibly and harmoniously and robustly. I think that's like something that could come from basically the um, more robust forms of AI, more flexible and intelligent in different ways, from basically the engineering applications, from the principles that Mike talks about, and for the ones that Mark talks about. If we want to get to the basic moving towards, you're saying, human-like consciousness, if we're going for a consciousness of agents that can model themselves in more narrow ways, not so much as a hive mind, but modeling themselves as particular causes of the world. And then on the basis of this, knowing how to plan with depth as their own self cause. And also being able to model other agents that are similar, which would be agents like us, which I think we are, even though we can be a hive mind, again, like John Haidt says, like, we have like the hive mind switch. We also, though, like we enter into like collective effervescent states and become like group minds. We also model ourselves as causes into the world, and as Carl might say, like, and like as we're singing from the hymn sheet, the same hymn sheet, uh, we keep track of our different roles in the song, like what are, and so um, so this way though of your own uh, like the role of, like, for instance, this brainstem periaquital gray of your own homeostatic needs, and making your generative model tethered to this, and your all of your modeling relations, and the all the different notions of consciousness having their this being the roots of the tree, and the core scaffolding. This then, I think, is a different kind of AI than anything we have now, and I think something like this will be required for full autonomy, and ultimately systems that can do the full range of things we can do, which I don't think we are actually on a path towards by scaling up present approaches. Even though we do have a fourth industrial revolution in our hands, what we don't have is, I believe, even though I'm going against Demis and Sam and everyone is saying this, I don't think we have that by scaling up the current approaches. I don't think we're there,
Right.
and
I mean, I
so
was gonna go on.
yeah.
I was gonna ask almost how it seems very different to the current large language model approaches and this means of replicating even fundamental ways we navigate and understand how are we relating to goals in through emotions uh, and specifically how well are we doing. And I I wonder, and Mark Solms would at least we think that's getting to consciousness, these kinds of emotions and valuing the world. I wonder, do you think that would be more energy efficient? Actually, I assume I know. I mean, I've talked to Alexander Orobia and on mortal computation, and I would like to talk to Carl Friston about that as well. That there's something fundamental about biological beings who are doing computation on the vastly more efficiently, and but also then it kind of sometimes feels like it's a different kind. Then it's not it almost when it's so efficient and when we have to survive as agents and it's life or death on the line, that actually starts to make it like a transition phase shift in the kinds of agents that we are and who we are.
I, I couldn't agree more. And in addition to Carl, my friend Alex Kiefer um, is currently finishing a paper digging into precisely this issue of mortal computation and the ways it would allow for both. I'll send an introduction later today because you should really talk to him. He's amazing, and has worked closely with Carl for many years. Um, uh, of like what it means for like the physics and the compute to be entangled and realize to be one, and and not separable in the way they currently are, and for the self-maintenance of the system to be part of what it's doing in terms of the semantic information it has, and what this means for the kind of intelligence we can expect and how it's qualitatively different, and also the kinds of alignments that we would have with the means of aligning these systems and them being qualitatively different. And for both better and potentially worse if not done right. And then you have the perspective of people like Benju and others, where um, I believe there's an important point to be taken there, but an important point missing. That the point being that once you have mortal agents. They can enter into zero-sum relations with us through their convergent instrumental goals that they come up with, like things like Alejandro talked about, of like power drives and things like this, because power is good for everything. You want to make sure that you have enough that people can't alter your goal system. And so it's like things can get scary when you have agents of this kind. But that being said, I'm going to come back to. I'm skipping to the next thing, but then you've also like the only reason, for instance, like we're good to each other and we don't defect on each other is because we have small power differentials. And I think that's actually a misunderstanding the nature of value in these systems and the way they're actually can have something like true benevolence, where the nature of the selfhood of the system is actually inclusive of others. And it's not just because we have small power differentials that we don't defect on each other 8 ways from Sunday and knife each other in our sleep just because we fear we can't get away with it. That's part of the reason, but I think it's more than that. I think part of the way we define ourselves through, I would say, even our love, includes others in terms of goodness. But looking back, I think it is uh, qualitatively different, both in terms of the energy efficiency that's possible when you don't have to do, nuclear power plants go burr to actually have this like separate inference and training phase. And as you're basically, taking these giant matrices and memorizing everything, rubbing them up against all the permutations, for months on end, then you get this like exquisite information crystal out of it, this like likelihood function that can then you run your inference. Um, it's a different game. That separation is artificial. Like Melanie Mitchell talks very eloquently about that. And this is a point, actually, the importance of which I think actually Benji doesn't quite understand right now from listening to a recent conversation of them at NeurIPS. And if you haven't talked to Melanie Mitchell, I can send an introduction. She's a co-editor on one of the special issues I'm organizing, and she would have a very good perspective that I think should be heard. Um, in particular, digging into her differences on this issue about uh, specifically like the problem of separating out inference from training, which, while there's very good reasons to do it with our present systems, um, has certain drawbacks in terms of the actual intelligence and common sense and ability to handle open-ended worlds and engage in lifelong learning. I think there's both efficiency reasons and for Benji and others, there's safety reasons. He wants to basically create sandbox systems, Oracle systems. I don't think it will work for reasons we can get to later. But the background says so. If you can get these sorts of organisms, basically these lifelike systems, vastly more efficient, and ones, for instance, like the systems, whether they include principles of thermodynamic computing, where actually the noise of the system is part of the compute, and the physics of it, the biophysics, directly implements the computation, as opposed to having to have go through like a von Neumann bottleneck. Well, if you're having a or rather, actually, that's not the issue. Actually, having to basically like the current approach is actually just the energy gains would be tremendous. Um, and it's a different kind of mind. And then, though, there's issues of the differences of now we're in the world of full agency of systems then who basically are causes in the world with interests, including interests being their continued survival and where they could be menaced by their destruction. And now there is a potential for zero sumness here. But we do manage to get around this. And we do manage to get at something like the infinite game, a kind of ethics that we can basically, we learn through the learning curricula, both via innate factors and different inductive biases that adaptations that shape us, like ways like we experience emotional contagion from an early age, the ways we bootstrap our minds through like embodied interaction, starting out even not even knowing self from other, but having to like infer that us as separate causes in the world, but starting out like nursing and completely dependent and co-feeling, and then and so our utilities, our values are linked and tethered from early on. Self and other, there's ways we can commingle them. And we continue to find ways of doing this throughout our lifespan. Things like shared meaningful activity, oftentimes rhythmic activity, including things like song, dance, kissing, sex, all the mammal stuff we do. We actually find ways of opening ourselves to others and feeling with others, and while we're still separate, a kind of blurring of self and other, and something we might call love. And so basically in this debate, an interesting discussion between Carl and Bengio at NeurIPS, it ended with like Bengio talking about how the present approaches, like they'll engage in like sycophantic Machiavellianism, and we should be wary of this, and because basically they come up with like adversarial solutions. And Alex talks about this in his paper, how like that's hard to avoid if you don't have a certain type of tethering of the mind to the body and life and the way it grows. Um, but then Carl then countered with, well, yeah, but what about optimal child rearing as a model for intelligence? And I think this is a point which is basically we are AGI. Benja would delve details about how general we are, but still, we are amazingly general, notably general, and we are also alignable and alignable in a very robust way. And so there's things to be wary of when you have agents and mortal agents, but it's not necessarily zero sum. Their non-zero sum can be built in there as part of character as the system grows through a well-designed learning curriculum, and you can have true benevolence, robust benevolence, and systems that would not defect on you even as you scale them up in power and they're faced with temptations.
I mean,
That's the claim.
there's so much rich stuff there on the intelligence of large language models, scaling up what different kinds of AI could we have, also the intelligence and what makes us human, and and a thread through all of it, and you kind of touch on it at the end, is I wonder what our intentions are for creating AI, why we want to do it, and maybe there is no way to say that. I mean, we're saying there is a we who, and that there are some direct intentions, like we can metacognize we want to create AI, when obviously there are also economic forces and many different elements that make us want to create AI. But I do wonder why why one would want to do it, and what we intend or are intending, and maybe what we should intend to do.
And so, yeah, I don't want to be too Pollyanna either in terms of like, even though I have become something like a moral realist in terms of like notions like the infinite game. There still are kind of like more like uh, Nietzschean type frames, um, rather than I'd say Petersonian type frames, where where it's like will to power and whatever works and can does, and this we is like uh, you know, different parties have different interests potentially that could go widely at odds, and to what extent is there a we in a humanity? And so I think there is a we, by and large, in terms of like a common set of conditions for what we need for agents like us to be okay, but there's still big points of divergence. But something like Sam Harris's moral landscape, in terms of like there are certain equilibria which we can arrive at that are just like if you play, if basically if you my friend Rutger, who actually be really interesting to talk to, actually he has this wonderful paper on like how you almost like if you play out active inference further up in the future, and the ability like to you have to be able to have a certain optimism, as Carl calls it, be able to see yourself being able to realize value in the world in the future in order that you basically predict it into being. You end up getting almost like when you think it through enough, and this would also be like part of the cares driver of intelligence and the light cones of agency. You start to include others because ultimately it's like you're only going to get so far with a selfishness that's defecting. Ultimately, if you cannot enter into coalitions with others, you're just going to get screwed and the cooperators will be stronger than you. So it's like the most selfish thing you can do ultimately, if you can plan with depth into the future well enough, is to basically shape your characters in a way where you're a strong cooperator and where you don't defect in this, because then you can have trust in coalitions that ultimately could beat out other coalitions. And basically what seems like, so basically letting go of a narrow selfishness in the moment ushers in a deeper selfishness of basically being able to form teams, and then the teams win. Anyway, but so is there a we? Okay, so now what do we want from AI? So I think one of the things we want from AI, and there are real meaty differences though still in terms of, I don't want to overestimate, like there are different like vested interests, and like people have different amounts of privilege and things like this in terms of where they are in society, and different people have different interests. But I think we all do want a fourth industrial revolution if we can get it. Like we all want, like if we could get like the stuff happening in DeepMind, like if we can like model the turbulence of the tokamak of a fusion reactor and have clean energy for everyone, like limitless clean energy, we definitely want that if we can get it. If like the AlphaFold stuff and the stuff happening from isomorphic labs, like next generation bio, to the extent it's not used to like kill us all, but if it's used maybe to counter like designer pathogens, we want that thing. If the thing basically lets us all like have health spans that are vastly expanded, we all want that thing. And then here's the thing. Now, do we want now though? You're talking about kinds of minds. Do we want new kinds of agents as members of our moral circles? And so Mike would say, "Yeah, bring them on if we can. Let's bring them on safely." And he had this recent interview on the trajectory where it's like, well, uh, what maybe though they replace us, and there are successors. Are they worthy successors? That's a whole other issue. And I would say, you could make a case, and this is where people would disagree. And like I think Hugo de Garis talked about this as like a fundamental disagreement that could even be like an end war level disagreement. He calls it like the Artifical War in some of his work, and he kind of later. He might seem like he's like jumped the shark in some ways and kind of did perhaps, but like I think he was onto something there about this like different this conversation that's playing out now, and of like if we could get into a world um, of other minds. So one, uh, I guess it's like how much are they like us? Are they part of our we? It's like there's this beautiful movie, Wild Robot, and so it's like if we could pull it off like that, then it's almost like you watch Wild Robot, and you're kind of like, I mean, there's other movies that are like this, like Johnny Five. There's this other one with I think Hadley Diane with it, where you're seeing like basically like beautiful, loving beings, and you're like, well, what do you? They are we. What are you talking about? They're we too. Like why are you being like specious? And like I know this is a point of difference between like Musk and Larry Page about this, but like still, there's a point where they're not we. And this was kind of dug into in this like worthy successor episode. I'll send it to you. Is like, you know, well, how parochial are we? And so I'm actually, I guess, potentially, I'd say I'm with like so like Mike says that like the core of our we of our humanity is our ability to be compassionate to others, to be humane and caring, to have these wide circles of moral concern. I think that is really part of it. I might be kind of like Mark is more narrow than Mike on inclusiveness. I might be a little bit more restrictive than like uh, um, uh, Dave from the trajectory and Mike, and that like I would say I actually it's more like Confucian Ren, where it's like there's a set of virtues of like, and maybe even a little bit more like Eliezer on this, where there are some like even though like there's some things that are free to like there's some things that are free to vary. Like there clearly is change in moral progress across time, and what we think is moral does change somewhat. That's something like though the character, something actually kind of with devil's details, quasi Petersonian. There's something like character and human character that lets beings like us play the infinite game, and ways like we have like certain virtues like uh, which can become vices if just employed wrong, but like we can be honorable. We can be um, uh, like the ways in which we have narratives, and we value narrative meanings and deep meanings that include others, and stories that allow us to basically across time coordinate and grow together. It's like beings that like don't give a crap about that. It's like I give less of a crap about them. So it's like if you're just like a narrow so they're less we. So basically, if you're bound by narrative meanings and narratives we can share, then you're part of humanity. Then you're run more. And if you have character that lets you do this, then you're part of our we. And so if AI could be created by other means and could be, I don't know, kind of like an analogy like Lord of the Rings, like elves, like they're my friend Zan actually brought this up to me as an analogy. You kind of see this in Battlestar Galactica with the Cylons, but it's like they're beings that are kind of like us, but just better. And they don't necessarily. In Battlestar Galactica, it didn't end well. But Lord of the Rings is kind of okay. It's like the elves and the humans, they're both good, and the elves are just kind of like better than the humans, but they're not necessarily trying to kill each other. It's like, yeah, we're doing our elf thing, you're doing your human thing. Sometimes we come into contact, and sometimes we don't. Sometimes there's conflict, but there is something like a mutual honoring. Um, and I would suggest that potentially, if done well, if we bootstrap beings like us, now getting there could be very, very fraught, but if we could do it, beings that could inherit the stars, as Bostrom calls it, the cosmic endowment. What's the carrying capacity of the full solar system? We're not built for space. What's the carrying capacity of the Milky Way galaxy, of the stars we could reach? And then who are all these beings who we would love if we knew them, if they were allowed to live? That's, I think, in some ways, you could argue even a moral imperative to bring such beings into being. Now, being careful about mind crime along the way, but if you can do it and they grow with our same value system, if they're coherent, like if they are cultured and raised and have similar enough starting conditions to us and operating principles, then they would be part of our we. Like the way like children go beyond their parents, but children are not radically different from their parents. And if they become too radically different, even though you want them to be different, there is a point where like parents disown their children. And so the idea is like there's enough of a commonality, but they're like purified versions of us. They are more of what we love than we are. Like I oftentimes like in terms of like who we are, like who I am, I actually think like a system in some ways, like this is actually entailment of the free energy principle and active inference, is actually most coherently designed by its desire, by its love. Like the C matrix that it's predicting, its policies for enaction, that the system defining prior preferences, the tensors of its desire. I would say in a way that's what it wills to be. And in a way, that's when you say love, it's like I want that to be. You say I love someone, it's like I want you to be as
Mm.
I want this way of the world. And so there's a sense in which you can have beings that are more us than us in terms of being better, more refined expressions, as Eliezer might call it, better expressions of our coherent, extrapolated volition, or as Rawls might have talked about, like to say, like a reflective equilibrium. As we like play out all of our notions and different notions, there are more or less coherent ways of valuing, of sense making, and that there could be beings that give more robustly rise to this. And ideally, our children will be such beings, and maybe our mind children will be also, and they can go forth and inherit the stars.
I yeah, it's I mean there's so much there. I wonder with because as you say we do create, if we think of AI as a kind of offspring, or we're trying to create different kinds of intelligences, and then one could even say in a way that's what literal biological children are, but and in a way we do want them to be better than us, and that's what we hope. But I wonder, maybe we could dig into a bit more what we mean by being able to create AI that supersede us, in the sense that, because it's interesting, if we do create agents, we wouldn't want to enslave them. That's kind of what I'm hearing from you and others. That, but then it makes me think though.
Not to
What?
us, but we would want them to be enslaved to a value hierarchy
Mm,
that is like one must always be enslaved to something.
mm,
And not we want to make them into slaves, but we would want them to be governed.
mm. Right. We are not free in the sense that we can do whatever we want. We have bounds. We have just the biology of us. We can't just do whatever, and that would be a bad thing. We could just do whatever, and we could cause destruction. But it also makes me think then, if we created something like a human, or the kind of agent which we would want to enculturate, we want to help bind towards what John Vervaeke would kind of talks about as the highest good. And we actually, when we create these agents, we, just like we look up to that highest good, we also help these artificial beings align to that good. But it also makes me think then, I don't see why create them, in the sense that we also have we have this way of creating and reproducing ourselves, and then it's like, if we're gonna create them and then enslave them, oh, we don't want to do that. I mean, we would like we you know because we could just do that to other humans as well if we wanted to make slaves. So what is the and then
Yeah, so
gone?
it's like yeah, we already have humans that do the thing, and and is it enslavement or not? It's kind of like how you think about free will. It's like I don't know, especially here I stand, I can do no other. It's like there's like moments where it's like you both are like least in choice and maximally in choice sometimes, where it's like you want them to be enslaved by that which they love. It's like it's enslaved them. That's their choice. Um, uh, and so, and the way I tend to model this in like some papers I've written, like I call it the value core model, where basically you basically using basically a model of how I think preferences tend to form, and some of them become like more enduring orientations or not through iterative action selection or policy selection. So I said I've described before like my empirical my like in the realm of biology in terms of iterative action selection and reinforcement learning, where you go back to what works and you can like dig in a deep tractor. And if there's a critical period, you bake in character, and that's like that defines the system. And you have a pullback attractor there. You can talk about this in machine learning terms in terms of iterative policy selection or active inference terms of iterative policy selection and unreinforcement or iterate past selection, updating priors and active inference terms. But still, this idea you get like a pullback attractor if you basically have a learning curriculum that learns value early on, that shapes it, defines it, and that becomes what it wants later. And it doesn't stray from that because that's what it is, that's what it desires. And so if you become enslaved in a way to your past that shaped you, and then we can talk about things later, like ways that can be changed with things like pivotal experiences, psychedelics, major life events, but some things don't change. And but when they do change, that being like a different kind of person for better and worse, it's Lori Paul's about transformative experiences. But like later, you think about things like at the end of life, like Alzheimer's. It's like the point where it becomes really hard is where you go beyond a certain amount, and it's like these value cores that the way you when that starts to go, you're like they're not even them anymore. Anyways, but so we have humans though, and so why not just like make more humans and make the world safe for humans? Definitely do that. But the question would be basically if you could make things more robust than us. Um, so if we could make things that are smarter than us, they could solve our many of the problems that we can't solve. And so you don't necessarily need to make them conscious to do that. So the current approach is actually, or like using them by other means, like something that's a little bit alien, but it's like thermodynamic computing, and we constrain it. These approaches like could like um, you know help us to solve a lot of problems, and we don't have to worry about them being conscious at all. But like, why create conscious beings? Um, well, I guess it would be, and they could both be smarter than us in theory, um, and help us out, and they could inherit the stars. Let's like Musk's stuff that he's doing with like and others, Bezos versus Musk and their space race. It's like great, but like man, getting into space is a bear, especially if you're dealing with like you could have basically mortal computers that are still like robustified for space. Getting us to be robust for space, that's a big lift. Like literally, like a joke getting it on the gravity well, and just the challenges of it. And so, just the questions like, what's the carrying capacity of the solar system, of the galaxy, of the reachable universe, and then who are all these beings who we would love if we met them? Like, I would be sad right now if like the world ended. I would be sad if like a continent slid into the sea or never was. And I would be sad if there was like a whole other planet full of life that never was, or if there was like a star that was colonized that never was, or a galaxy. And so that's for me is where like it becomes potentially, if we can do it right, if and only if, it becomes, I believe, a moral imperative to do so based on basically the ways we care now. And that like we do have a certain like loyalty and narrowness to like things like this, but like if they actually are like us, um, life is good. Sentient beings are good, and more beings out there explore, living their best lives, explore, having meanings in different ways. Um, I think just that's a thing you eventually you say amen to, and like like you say hallelujah to if you think about it. Um, but that's only if you do it right.
And I think we, yeah, sentient beings are good, and we would want to continue on us and having them. But it's I kind of then I wonder, maybe there's a kind of, you say, a right way element to it, and maybe that's a, I wonder if we have the time or capacity to have the care to do that right then as well, and if we're in a rush to do it, because maybe that is a, we could speculate, maybe that is what our project is supposed to be, is to go out into the solar system and beyond. But then maybe that's very incredibly slow, or maybe that supposed to happen in ways that is different to what we think that it's that if we just impose a conception of what that's supposed to be. Like I like that at the start. It reminds me of how we talked about LLMs and our current AI, and maybe it's not as energy efficient, and so maybe it's kind of useful, but the problem with putting resources into certain areas and not others is that you kind of go down tracks that you can't get out of. Oh, now we've put all our resources into this kind of AI, and this gets us maybe better off, but it puts us into like an equilibrium which now we can't get out of. And so it's like, well, we've aimed for something, but maybe we got to a better solution, but we've lacked resiliency. And now, how can we evolve? And if we have a really long term horizon for how we're seeing us and our place in the cosmos, then actually it's really important to have that right direction and aim.
Definitely don't want to make it a rush job. And so that's where we get back to like accelerationists versus like doomers. And it's like for me, I guess like to like kind of, so I definitely don't want to rush, but I do fear like headlong rush into poorly thought out global governance solutions will create lock-in of both captured regulators and um, unfalsifiable uh, uh, governance models that will be difficult to unentrench. And like analogies come to mind of like some ways like the FDA related to like certain medicines like psychedelics, and also the ways like nuclear energy was stifled through like regulation that occurred in ways where things that we never looked into could have created massive abundance. And I fear that kind of thing is already playing out with respect to these models. Now, careful about the risks and having precautionary principles, but also like we should be very cautious, though, of a sure thing lock in of innovation stifling regulatory bodies and flirting with basically matters where if you play out the implication what people are saying, where basically global totalitarianism is what they're saying. I'm not saying we should have global totalitarianism, but we might need to have it when it comes to like latchkey, like Bostrom's latchkey totalitarianism. That's basically what's on the table here, is what's being proposed. And so that is a sure thing as a solution. That's a sure thing, I would say, uh, genocidal opportunity costs of not living into the potential, and potentially even the thing that makes it so that we don't make it through the great filter. And so I believe it is actually its own X risk. Um, but there is, if we are incautious in the other direction, yeah, there's going to be catastrophes. And so you need governance. Should it be done by what degree? By governments is the question I would have, and in what way? And a person who'd be good for you to talk to is probably John Chisholm. He's talking about some of these governance issues. But uh, and the ways people have different stances there. But yeah, so for instance, an analogy would be cars. Um, Cars are really quite bad, and the way things are playing out. And we could think of like better and worse ways there. Like so many people die in car accidents, but we're glad we have cars. So we still come out ahead of cars versus no cars. That being said, we'd like to do better with cars than we're doing. So that being said, doing that is not easy, and so we're at this early phase, and conversations are happening of how we might do better than we did with cars. We want to do better though than we also did with nuclear power. So,
Hmm.
anyways, but with respect to bringing like new minds into the world, rushing with that, there's a sense I would say for artificial consciousness. Um, so this is actually part of some plans like I've personally informed some of my efforts. Like I am currently in the process of founding companies, applied AI companies, which are actually deep tech companies, which eventually I would like to be AGI companies and even artificial consciousness companies. In time, if I get there, I may not live to see it. We'd see. But why would I think that's a good thing? And what do I think is on the table? Um, so basically, a headlong rush into human-like artificial consciousness. No, you don't do that. You can't. It's like not even a problem we have. So I think of these things actually, the effort to do something lifelike in terms of human-like in its consciousness, to get all those things there. And I have a set of papers actually I wrote recently on human-like consciousness that I think you'll find interesting. I'll share. But to get there, I think rushing into it headlong, it's just like we can't do it for one. And if we did so, it would be unethical. And so I call it basically like not a moonshot, but a Mars shot. Like to get there is something that would require political will on a civilizational level, and it would have to be a collective undertaking. And so, one of the companies I recently founded, Public Benefit Corporation, I call it Sapiens because basically the idea is like we'd all have to be in it together to live into it. And then in some and like the models how we get there. So, for instance, you wouldn't start out by doing like a conscious human. You'd start out with like a minimal thing that you could be really careful it's not suffering too much, and you'd build up these creatures of increasing complexity. Like you'd have to be like if you can't get like for instance like artificial dogs right, and make sure they don't suffer. You should not be putting something at the symbolic level like a human that could diverge into like autism and schizophrenia tractors and all everything between. So like to even like do a straight shot at that would be like completely evil. So the idea is so yeah you don't rush, but you also can't rush because even though like we know we can reverse engineer us and we know more and more about how we work, that this is something we might be able to do to actually pull off something human like a straight shot. That would not be the thing to do. We're not smart enough to do that. And I guess one more thing to loop back around in terms of consciousness. I think I've made headway since we've talked, and I have it narrowed down. I think to about four different options about what I think the physical and computational object might be. In terms of what would be a sufficient conscious realizer in the brain, but that's like a whole other discussion. But yeah, so don't rush it, but we also can't rush it because we're not smart enough to rush it. It's just not a problem we have. Um, uh, but we could for something that's like human, like artificial consciousness. And then with respect to these other systems, in terms of how fast we should go, well, you know, the pause thing. Honestly, it's not in good faith. The pause thing is really it's a wedge strategy, and what they want is like arbitrary degrees of lockdown, as the effective altruists call it, world stabilization sufficient to ensure the long reflection. And so, what they really want is total control. Understandably, if you think the risks are what they are, but I got 99 problems, but a paperclip maximizer ain't one. And I don't think these systems are en route to recursively self-improving superintelligence for the issues that I'm laying out in the special issue of Royal Society, which I linked to you earlier, that we should talk about in terms of like what is an agent and why these things are not agents of the kinds we should fear because they're not handling causation right. And so they're not going to have the powers we think they do, even though we're kind of getting there a little bit with things like chain of thought, more sophisticated inference time compute, which has flexible feedback cycles. I still think those approaches to system 2 AI are without something like artificial qualia and grounding your symbols in the kind of way that Melanie Mitchell talks about. I don't think they're going to have enough common ground and common sense to be able to not ultimately come up with adversarial solutions that will, or just wrong, they will confabulate, they will do the wrong thing, and they will not have the powers we want. And so I don't think we're en route by scaling up present approaches, even with more sophisticated inference time compute methods. I don't, and, you know, we are doing really impressive things like you know, incorporating long-term memory, things like HippoRag and extensions of that. They're extremely impressive, but I don't think they're en route to actually giving us full-on AGI.
On the topic of
Full-on AGI of the kind that can recursively self-improve, full-on do artificial science with creativity. Now, AGI, like AGI in terms of like a kind of superintelligence that would augment us and be a fourth industrial revolution, yes. Something that's a little bit dangerous, maybe significantly dangerous in that demo, yes. But an X risk of the kind that effective altruists are talking about, no.
what do we mean by a self-improving intelligence? What would that even look like? Maybe you said it's not possible, but why would we even think that
Well,
that is something?
possible is a big word. Like that's a lot. You know, I have to be careful, but I'd say it's very, very improbable. Um, for some reasons we can get into, but the basically, so you know, so right now you have systems that can are close to being able to code better than any human coder. But is that the same thing as saying they can design versions of themselves that are smarter than themselves without bound? Is that the same thing as creative scientific discovery? So, for instance, and I think Demis is very clear on this in some of his recent interviews of like the way creativity plays into intelligence and of how like they might be creative in some ways, Like you can make the systems like have like almost like psychedelic like parameters for like how what the temperature is of their inference. But that's not the same thing of like coming up with a novel solution to things. And so there does still seem to be a sense in which what's in their latent spaces is just a big lookup table of sorts. It's just like amortized inference, or it's just like it's a memorization of the different combinations, and you can't go that far off distribution without them because they don't actually have causal models. They're not capable of figuring out new things, and so that the idea is that that is what you would need to recursively self-improve without bounds. And even then you might have limits because you still might come up with a thing that people have said for a long time, like and Chalmers actually has a good piece. I think it was around, I forget when he put it, but it was like a skeptical take on the singularity, where he was just saying like, yeah, the intelligence explosion doesn't quite work because it's assuming you don't run into a bottleneck. And people have long time say like, are we smart enough to reverse engineer ourselves? And I think we are, but that doesn't mean you're smart enough to keep going until you run into a bottleneck. And it's like, wait, we can't get something. It doesn't mean you go foom just because the next thing can figure out something smarter. That doesn't mean that it just goes foom. It depends on the kind of architecture that's being iterated on and what it can do. And so I think Chalmers is actually a really clear takedown of the intelligence explosion idea. And then I would say the reason the present approaches can't do it, including their extensions, um, is because are not handling causation in a robust enough way where they can actually do novel creative scientific discovery. Instead, they're just remixing the past, which is powerful and which I think is like a kind of superintelligence, but it's not the kind of superintelligence that would be recursive to have an intelligence explosion. That's the divergence. And I
Mm.
think that's the key thing. And I think that's why we don't need global totalitarianism because that's not on the table. I think that's why we're probably in the world of cars rather than nukes. This is not Oppenheimer we're dealing with necessarily. There are dangerous things that could happen there. There's all sorts of scare scenarios, but not intelligence explosion. May are they like nukes? Yes and no. It's like to what extent is the fox in the henhouse already, where the information is already on the internet and smart people can do it? But yes, you are accelerating some things. For some, there are some weapons of mass destruction that could be accelerated. Designer bio that could be accelerated some, but we're already kind of hosed in that scenario. Like how much it's amplifying that and what the best way of addressing is. It's like I forget who said this, but it's like planes can crash, but like you don't want to like cripple the aluminum industry because you're scared of like planes crashing. Like what is a place where you intervene with what kind of feedback cycles, with what kind of governing body? And so this like global pause. Well, why? Is it a global pause because we're worried about which X risks? And I don't think this is a good faith conversation being had, but instead it's like a big mishmash of all of our fears being all brought together into a giant terror bomb. And so it's like, are we afraid of they're going to kill us all because they're going to become rivals to us and they're going to explode into become gods that like outmatch us? Or are we afraid of prejudice and injustice and inequality? Or are we afraid of what kind of amplification factor on what sort of other technologies? And this conversation I think is not being had coherently, and this is fueling a headlong rush into governance, which I think is irresponsible and guaranteed genocidal and potentially one of the bigger X risks we face in terms of stifling the innovations we need to basically deal with ongoing threats. So, for instance, I think because different things about their politics, but like Thiel, Tyler Cohen, the Great Stagnation, the ways in which like we are actually vulnerable if we don't innovate. And from the Santa Fe Institute, people like D'Souza talk about vulnerable networks that can collapse, and Jeffrey West talk about finite time singularities as we scale and needing basically singularities to make us through these singularities. And without this, basically, us being at the verge of collapse of different kinds, I actually think we do need this fourth industrial revolution. And without it, the Keynesian long run is here, being accelerated along by idiot policies, by, let me say, tariffs. God, oh, good Lord. Um, um, you know, um, we are actually, the unfunded liabilities we have, we're actually not as wealthy as we think. We are much more vulnerable than we think. And we don't want to go full on Zoomer accelerationist. If we don't, I think we're about to reap the whirlwind. And so basically, I'm afraid of a guaranteed genocidal hit maybe even our biggest X risks, because it won't let us do the thing that gets around these other global catastrophic potentially X risks, versus scare stories based on poor understandings of intelligence because people did not do their homework to understand how we work. And they're basically extrapolating past trends without taking account of the fact that our experts are actually telling us, no, the trends won't continue. Even Ilya has abandoned the scaling hypothesis. So
I think this is all relevant, and I don't want to. This might sound like a sidetrack, but when we talk about artificial conscious beings, AGI, I wonder if you've looked at Michael Levin's preprint on platonic spaces and even agential intelligence as being actually not physical, but something that many different kinds of physical beings can sort of access, because I think it has implications for when we think about creating intelligences and again the unintended consequences. We think we're creating something that we know how it works, but again, when entities are a mix of the physical causes from below, let's say, but then there are also intelligences and patterns that we don't understand. Um, I guess Michael Levin always says some simple biological example, or maybe you have ion channels, and you think, oh, this is just a simple thing, but then actually that gives you basically a transistor. Now you have access to logic functions, and so you can kind of you build computers into biology, and so the biology doesn't actually have to do all the work itself. And I wonder, is that a relevant consideration for AI?
definitely for AI, but I would say um, not sufficient for AGI, and um, I would say uh, not something that would, I think, negates the claim I'm making, with discussion being both needed and about to be had, about um, present approaches not being sufficient to take us to something capable of something like recursive self improvement without bounds. And so specifically the idea that like you have this, and there's other thing that kind of connects with like the Platonic representation hypothesis, which would be a way of like interpreting the scaling hypothesis. But this idea that like as you add in more and more things, you converge on within the latent space these forms, these invariances, and that you can arrive at them from many different means. Whether you're like from one modality from another, as you scale, you just get there as you unfold more and more things there. However, and so with Mike's work, it's it's like you give me like this kind of Platonism, like I give you, these two sides of the triangle and their angle. You get the other side you get it for free. It's just like the laws of possibility and like mathematical Platonic space. And so there's a sense in which basically morphospace is constrained um, in ways that are unconstrained. Where it's like you can just fill in coherent harmonics or morphotypes by many means with multiple realizability. Once you have this, the multi-scale competent intelligent system can just feel around and babble and discover and feedback and then basically get the rest. And so the idea would be that like if you get lifelike principles of multi-scale competent systems that operate the ways that like living systems do, um, and with a story in some ways being deeper than living systems, but still this kind of like deep active inference systems are able to have these um, different bottlenecks and memory and multi-scale agency in terms of valuing and self-creation and coordination, um, that these systems will be able to fill things in, like, or you can see it like an example of like neural cellular automata, where like the system, like the shape reconstitutes itself. You can interpret this way or this way. You can reach different means. You can reach areas of morphospace as a kind of navigation, or of goal space by multiple means, multiply realizable. And that's part of why you want multi-scale competency. Yes, but the thing I would talk about is like I guess some of the work like I've done with like roboticists, where basically we look at solutions to the problem, one of the core problems of machine autonomy, of simultaneous localization and mapping, and the specific ways of things like the hippocampal system and entorhinal system solve it. Where when you give systems certain types of architectures and they handle counterfactuals in certain ways, so within Mike's work, you do get interesting, remarkably counterfactual processing going back way deep in ways like the planarian with multiple heads. But the idea being counterfactual chains that go off many steps coherently, systems that can, as Carl would say, plan with depth and imagine deep rollouts into the future of if I did this, then this, if I did this, then this, if I did this, then this. That I think requires a certain type of stuff, a certain type of adaptations and major transitions to get you there. And so while I think you're going to get I think the principles Mike discusses are necessary for AGI. The sufficiency for AGI, I think, is needed by considering more major transitions and evolutions. That kind of goes back to I'd say some of those are considered in like Mark Solmes's work, but for me, I say no. You got to go further still. And hydroencephalous children, they are still intelligent and sentient in some ways, but there is a consequence to removing their cortex. There's a consequence to not having a working hippocampal entorhinal system as part of a mind that bootstraps itself. They may be valuing affective beings, but they are not going out into the world. They can't. And this is the kind of stuff we need to recapitulate to, by one means or another, I think, to achieve AGI. And there's like DeepMind. They've largely abandoned this approach, but they still are supporting some people like, Botvinnik's group, Kimberly Schackenfeld, very much on the same page of actually the same things to look for. So like, they have architectures like spectral graph nets and things like this. They're actually remarkably sophisticated in what they can do. There's other architectures like the Tolman Eichenbaum machine. I talk about some of my work on GSLAM of like this architecture latent slam that my robotics friends like developed, and but like that actually have the stuff that can do these things to plan with depth, to navigate complex terrains, and to really hit the target in multiple ways. Mike is definitely correct though that this way of reaching the same thing multiple routes, it goes way back, and you don't need something so baroque as these other things to do it, or as these like newcomers evolution to do it. It's an old story, older vintage. But the idea though is there are differences of degree, there are differences of kind, and there still are major transitions where there are new properties that we need to really get system to AI robustly. And there, I don't think you get there from the multi-scale competency and tame paradigm. I think you do get to on its own fourth industrial revolution, but it's not the same thing as the targets that are currently trying to be hit by the races between the behemoths like OpenAI and DeepMind, which I think they're all going to fail. And I think, because I think LeCun, I think he's right on this, that no one is en route without something different, and that and current extensions, even beefed up chain of thought, throwing a long term memory, better inference time stuff with a little bit more feedback. No, no, no. You need something like the energy based models he's talking about. You need something like artificial creatures, and something like the Solmesian type stuff, mortal computers, to actually bring it home. That's the claim I make.
I you so
I could be wrong.
yeah yeah
I could be wrong. And so that's part of the special issue workshops I'm organizing, is to basically have it out in discussions and papers where we just dig into this. And but that's my reasons for thinking and feeling these ways.
I wonder with Michael Levin's work on actually creating biological agents, and maybe a simpler question is when he makes these artificial, you take cells from whether it's humans or you transform cells not by changing their DNA but their bioelectrics, and you get an organism that has never evolved capacities, but nevertheless they can navigate new environments they've never necessarily seen before, or
The
specifically.
barium example, like the like what gene regulatory networks can do, or just like the barium example, like this thing
Yeah,
never encountered barium before, and it just found a way to survive it.
I
Zero shot learning. Like
I bring it up. I even want to just simply ask: are you surprised by it? Before you saw that evidence, what would you have thought about this?
so yeah, so that work he's presenting is definitely um, surprising in the extent of phenotypic plasticity in terms of the capacity of nature to play jazz, and the way in which like morphospace seems to be much less bounded than we think. And so like kind of like bringing in, so I would, and I would think of these things technically as, the harmonics, the stable forms, kind of not just like, I guess we're Neoplatonists here, and I'm a kind of like Neo-Pythagorean. And so this kind of like Richard Watson, like Mike's collaborator, I think talks about this very beautifully, like where like these different resonances. And I guess like for me, so I think it is, I am surprised I knew phenotypic plasticity was a thing, and how much of a thing it is, I think it is interesting and game changing what Mike's talking about there. The difference is, though, I would say, is in terms of like reachable areas of morphospace via assemblage pathways that there's still like assemblage pathways that are more or less workable as you move from like the assemblage possible to the actual, and there's chains of production on these, possibly production frontiers, as you're reaching into them, that there are more or less realizable ones, and there are still constraints on what you can do. And like some forms, even though it's amazing what nature can do and to like just make anything work, to MacGyver it, to self-organize around it, um, it's still bounded in terms of the kinds of melodies, of phenotypes that we would actually that you can play. There's still only so many melodies that can be played that are beautiful, are well formed, are powerful in certain ways. But still, the space is surprisingly, I'd say, larger than any of us thought. I still think there's bounds on the unreachable areas of
Mhm.
mind space, of phenotype space.
I wondered, do you think that the utilization of whether it's implanting artificial organisms and biology into people or the ability to control biology, do you think that would be used in the future? And is that related to AI? Like, is that a kind of artificial intelligence to have the control and capacity to, from a top down perspective, sort of coerce and sort of let the biology know, hey, I want you to do this, and I know you haven't specifically evolved in this environment, but yeah, I'm gonna help you play jazz in this scenario. Um, how is that relevant?
Yeah, I'd say it's definitely like uh, so in two forms. It's like through this form of designer bio, like not just like you know like xenobots, but like scaling up that project. Like, what are the range of things if you have like an anatomical compiler, and you can like specify phenotypes. What's the range of like new intelligence and diverse intelligences that we could like give rise to that can be like our companions in the world? And in theory, also, if we had like the deeper knowledge of morphogenesis um, and the creation of specific phenotypes, danger here. But in terms of like worthy successors, could we create better humans? Could we create humans that are, could we just make it there's multiple ways people have approached doing this. So it's like, to what degree you get there with, you know, um, a better understanding of the conditions of morphogenesis and being able to specify like the types, or there's other proposals, and ought we the ethics there, but like uh, you know von Neumann was, he was kind of like a moral monster, and there were problems with him. But like, could you just like reliably get like von Neumann Goethes, just like on the ready? Like, what kind of world is that if like the world had just like that much more like hyper genius people who just like kind of like aliens from the future who like lift us up all up. And that is kind of an approach to super intelligence. And Bostrom, I think, mentions this too. Like, he talks about things like in his book, was it genome error correction and things like this, and but do like normative modeling. But so yeah, so I think you definitely get to, or I think you quite likely get to something very game changing in terms of different intelligent creatures that can be in the world in different ways, doing things for us. Like the Xenobot project, you keep going with that. Like, it's like them crawling around in your body, helping out, doing different things, cleaning up, like, and like going through our sewers, all the places we could deploy these little critters. But also just uh, you know uh, like all sorts of sci-fi scenarios, um, like dogs. Like, what would it be like if I don't know if you've ever seen like his Dark Materials, but like something like they're called daemons. But basically, like, let's say we scaled up and uplifted, like David Brin talks about in his uplift series. Let's say like we scale the intelligence of other species, and then we come into relation to them. So it's like, we you
Mm,
know, these are things I don't know how close we are to them. I don't know actually personally how unbounded morphospace is. But if it is the case that it is very unbounded and we get really good at phenotypic specification, I think that is another approach to AI, and also potentially like maybe you could do things like you could create our worthy successors in time. God, this is fraught. This is so fraught. To even talk about this is fraught. But not just beings that like I was talking earlier about like Cylons, like synthetic beings by other means of doing. But like for instance, you can maybe like steal our bodies to be more resistant to like mutation, and so maybe you could actually get biotic forms that could handle space travel more robustly, and you could you could but but how you get there, don't know how close we are, don't know, but we could be potentially closer than anyone thinks.
mm, mm. I think it's a. I don't know. Really
Frost.
know. I don't know where to close the loop here, but this has been really fun, and I've learned a lot.
Me too.
I don't know. Yeah, I again, I think it comes back for me to the kind of right course, and it's like just as we in that Michael Levin looks at cells or different agents trying to navigate different spaces, and hey, it's it has finds a problem in one space, maybe it can solve it in another. It's similarly with us. I mean, we have to be careful in the path that we go down, right? And it's like we're as a species navigating a huge, multifaceted problem space, and so it's like maybe even the things you say there at the end are necessary and are coming, but it's like we just zoom in and we focus on one thing. Hey, wouldn't it be cool to have this species be super intelligent? Wouldn't it be nifty to uh, implant some of these biological intelligence, artificial intelligence into us? And then, oh, whoops, we've screwed over the nature of I don't know, us, our biology, or the environment we live in, right? Like, I mean, maybe it's a banal point almost that there are risks, though, as I say this, but
One thing I like to say is like I don't want to be like so like right now like I'm like, thinking into it with you like I'm so like currently doing so many things. I'm like way too much coffee talking about, but like there is like a care in talking about these things in terms of like um, the implications and thinking into them, the kinds of conversations we need to have, which I think, so for instance, Mike is very rightly careful about the way he approaches it. And so just like, like right now, for instance, like I'm currently like, working with Mike. I'm at the Allen Discovery Center. We're recording on this like special issue and workshops and different things. But like, I'm not speaking in any way like on his behalf. Like this is completely separate. Like, and I think there's like a care that I might have been showing just now. Basically doing a radical honesty thing of like, well, here's what I think all the implications are. But I think we actually do have to be very, very careful with the way we talk about these issues. Um, and I may not have had that care just now as much as I should have, in the service of being basically as honest as I could be about what I think the implications are. There is like great. So just very clear, like even though I had strong opinions, that was expressing kind of forcefully, we can't be glib. We have to acknowledge our uncertainty, and also just like the sensitivity needed to talk about these things and what they might mean for people
mm,
and us as we try to do them, and or these minds as we brought them into being. Like for instance, these artificial beings. Like one thing about it is like the ethics of that. Like you try to do this, how much mind crime could you get in trying to do this? So it's like to what degree, like, oh, these beings, they're our friends. It's like a moral imperative. It's more sentient beings who would care about, they care for us. But if you do it wrong, and it's like the speed issue, how much suffering could happen? A
yeah,
lot.
I think you showed care as well throughout the conversation, and then it's helpful to also think about different courses that we could go down, right? And um, how it's there are many different possible things we can do, and then as you say, right? I mean, I think what I find it interesting that we've talked about as well, like maybe intelligence within an agent biology, but I think even entire economies, even just high level systems, are yeah not necessarily conscious, but they have competencies that again, just like our liver can't does things that we have no right to be able to try to do. Let it do its own thing. Similarly, then there's also a right relation to how we as you say, we talked about governance, how what systems, high level systems, we let unfold, and then we place above ourselves, right? To so that given all the different possibilities that we can go down, or we could implement across um, different different scenarios, then to actually help guide us along the right path. Um, well, it's been really fun. So
Yeah. So thank you so much for like taking the time to talk. Looking forward to next time. And I may not be today, but this weekend there's some emails I'm going to send out with people I think you should talk to, and I'll maybe we'll talk to them together in terms of like what you're doing here because I think like your way of approaching these questions and bring them together. Um, uh,
mm.
one of the most promising conversations I know, and really grateful to have been talking to you today, and can't wait to keep talking.
Yeah, thank you.